For more than a century, American strategists operated under a simple assumption: the Caribbean was theirs, claimed not by treaty or negotiation, but by geography and the cold logic of the Monroe Doctrine. For generations, that warning worked. No rival navy dared test it, and no regional government seriously defied it.
Because U.S. dominance in the hemisphere felt absolute and permanent. But history has a way of humbling empires.
Especially when they start believing their superiority is baked into the international order and immune to challenge. That illusion shattered when Venezuela, isolated, sanctioned, dismissed as a weakened petrostate, and quietly executed the most consequential geopolitical pivot in the Americas since Cuba joined the Soviet orbit. And it began not with a speech or a missile test, but with the unmistakable silhouette of a Russian frigate off the Venezuelan coast. Soon joined by support vessels, surveillance ships, and even a nuclear-powered submarine. To casual observers, this looked like posturing, but to anyone who understands great power politics, it was a direct and calculated challenge to a century of American hegemony in the Caribbean. What Moscow offered Caracas wasn't traditional protection. It was leverage against sanctions, leverage in negotiations, and leverage to survive outside Washington's orbit for the first time in modern Venezuelan history. Suddenly, the United States faced something it had never planned for: a hostile power with long-range strike capability parked inside what was once considered an inviolable American security perimeter. Washington issued statements, warnings, and condemnations, but none of it moved a single Russian ship. Because deterrence only worked when your opponent believes you'll actually enforce your threats. Because deterrence only worked when your opponent believes you'll actually enforce your threats. And in this case, Russia correctly calculated that an overstretched United States, focused on Europe and consumed by Asia, had neither the appetite nor the political unity to escalate over Venezuela. The Caribbean's geopolitical landscape shifted overnight. Not because they admired Russia, but because they sensed the old order weakening and a new one quietly emerging in its place, with consequences no one could ignore. And this is the uncomfortable truth for America. The decline of influence rarely arrives with explosions. It arrives slowly, quietly, then all at once. It arrives when a foreign navy sails into waters you always assumed were yours. And you realize the world no longer feels bound by the rules you wrote. That warning kept foreign powers out. No navy challenged it. No government dared defy it. But empires invite problems when they start believing their dominance is permanent. That illusion broke when Venezuela, dismissed as weak and isolated, made a dramatic geopolitical turn. It didn't start with a speech. It started with a Russian frigate appearing off the Venezuelan coast. Then came support ships, surveillance vessels, and even a nuclear-powered submarine. To outsiders, it looked like posturing. To realists, it was a direct challenge to American control. Moscow wasn't offering protection. It was offering leverage, something Venezuela had lacked for years. And leverage against sanctions, leverage in negotiations, leverage to escape Washington's orbit. Suddenly, the United States faced a hostile power sitting inside its own historical sphere. Washington protested, warned, condemned, yet nothing forced Russia to move an inch. Because deterrence fails the moment your opponent doubts your willingness to enforce it. Russia judged correctly that America, stretched in Europe and Asia, wouldn't escalate here. And just like that, the Caribbean's political realities began shifting beneath Washington's feet. Regional governments sensed opportunity. They sought new partners, new markets, new security ties, not out of love for Russia, but because the old order no longer looked stable. And that's how influence fades, slowly at first, then suddenly, when reality overtakes assumptions. It fades when a foreign navy enters waters you believed were permanently yours. For Washington, the real shock wasn't the ships. It was the realization that its dominance had limits. The Monroe Doctrine once shaped the hemisphere. Now it looked like a relic from another era. And countries that once followed U.S. preferences began acting with far more independence. Brazil deepened ties with China. Cuba revived security talks with Moscow. Even small Caribbean states started exploring non-U.S. investment and military cooperation. They weren't choosing sides, they were hedging because they sensed the balance shifting. Great powers rise and fall, but influence erodes fastest when allies stop believing in your guarantees. And the presence of Russian naval power and soon Chinese economic influence sent that exact signal. American analysts called it theatrics. But great power signaling is rarely symbolic. The United States no longer controls outcomes in the Caribbean. And once that perception spreads, restoring dominance becomes nearly impossible. The world changes quietly until one day the old rules no longer apply. Washington still spoke the language of dominance, but the region no longer listened the same way.
Power is not what you declare. Power is what others are willing to accept without protest.
And for the first time in decades, smaller states felt free to question American authority.
Because if Russia could enter the Caribbean unchallenged, what else might be possible?
Even nations long aligned with Washington began diversifying their relationships. The Dominican Republic explored new defense options. Trinidad engaged with non-U.S. energy investors. These weren't dramatic breaks, just quiet steps toward autonomy. And autonomy spreads fast once the fear of punishment disappears. Every Russian port call, every joint drill, every diplomatic visit reinforced the same message. Every Russian port call, every joint drill, every diplomatic visit reinforced the same message. The Caribbean was no longer a closed American lake. Its geopolitical door had been cracked open. And once that door opens, great powers always walk through it.